thank you for joining us. You launched your campaign in Calgary here. You actually did a good place, the Wild Rose Brewery. As a Wild Roser, I appreciated the tribute. You launched your campaign in Calgary, and just yesterday on Triggered with Corey Morgan, a Western Standard show, you announced an equalization policy. And I'm going to ask you another question on equalization. So,
okay.
But maybe a broader question here. There's been a lot of conflict between Alberta and Quebec for a long time, and it's at least perceived probably to be at a greater level now than it has been in a very long time. You've served as the Premier of Quebec. Thank you. Here to serve. You've served as the Premier of Quebec, and you served in the Mulroney government. But you know, the last time when the Mulroney government kind of ended badly, as the National Conservative Coalition fragmented very much along regional lines. Why should Westerners trust you as coming from Quebec, and you have to defend the interests of your province when you're the Premier, but why should Albertans look to you to have their best interests at heart?
Now, Derek, and thank you, first of all, for the invitation and for pointing out that I think we accepted spontaneously, Roman and Scott and I, this invitation to be with you today. And I'm delighted to join you and to share some thoughts about this leadership race and to do it here in Alberta and Western Canada. Let me start by saying that, yes, I talked and I'm proposing an Alberta Accord, and there's a reason for that, and the reason why I chose to come to Calgary on the very first day of my campaign. I'm very much running as someone who has a very deeply held belief in Canada, and that belief includes the reality and the fact that if we want this country to succeed, Alberta has to be at the very heart of what we do. It can't be on the sidelines. And what I wanted to do early on in the campaign is acknowledge the fact that a lot of Albertans today feel left out. They feel they've been set aside, that they're not recognized, that the rest of the country, not just the federal government, but the rest of the country has not acknowledged the fact that Alberta has gone through a very tough time. And yet when Alberta is prosperous and doing well, the rest of the country is very happy to share the wealth with Alberta, with the rest of with all of Canada. And when times are not as good, well, all of a sudden, it's as though Albertan doesn't count anymore. And it's one of the reasons why I'm in this race, Derek, because I know from the experience I've had, and as someone who believes very deeply in Canada, that the only way this country can succeed is if Alberta's at the table and participating in shaping the agenda of the country and its policies. It's what I believe in. And it's been the common thread of my whole political life. And so I'm here to say that not only do I think that's the case, but I also think it's important that we put it into policies. And I understand the anger and the disappointment. But the real question in a leadership race and for a leader is, what do you do after? What happens? What do you do if people are disappointed and they feel that anger? How do we translate that into something that is going to be substantive and real and change things? And that's what I want to do in this leadership race. And that's why I've proposed an Alberta Accord, starting with Alberta for all of Western Canada, but Alberta as the center and the focus of how we need to change the country, starting with Alberta.
So when I want to talk about what that looks like, I mean, I don't have to remind anyone here, yourself or anyone attending, is my microphone cutting out again? It's good? Okay.
That's okay. I can do the talking.
I was only ever in an opposition as a politician. So I only ever got to ask questions, not answer them. Alberta and to a lesser extent, BC and Saskatchewan have paid a ton into equalization. Alberta pays into equalization, even when we're going through a bust, not just in the booms. We got a boom right now. We'll probably screw it up again, but we do it even in busts. And at the same time, I think Albertans feel punished because despite the contribution of Alberta and the West more broadly, the federal government and some provinces go out of their way to hem us in from fully developing the resources that pay the bills nationally. So you put forward the idea of this Alberta Accord on the Corey Morgan show, and this is going to involve equalization. Why don't you flesh out a bit more what you, I understand there's negotiation in these things, and
Yes.
it would be between you and premiers, Council of the Federation, but what would you see as a starting place for what this might look like?
Well, I become leader of the party, and we're successful in forming a national government. And forming a national government also means including Alberta. In the first 30 days after my election, I would meet with the Premier of Alberta to start the process of defining what is going to be an Alberta Accord. And in the first 6 months of my mandate, I'd also meet with the provinces through the Council of the Federation that I was part of creating in 2003, the chair, a meeting that, by the way, would be co-chaired by whoever is the chair of the Council of the Federation and the Prime Minister. And that's not a matter of detail. We live in a federal system of government, ladies and gentlemen. Canadians tend to forget that. Certainly Ottawa does. They don't seem to be aware. In this federal system of government of ours, which is very decentralized, it is the provinces that run this country on a day-to-day basis. I know, I've been there. I've been on both sides. Education, health, I mean, you name it. And so we need to acknowledge that. And the provinces are not a sub-level in a federation of the federal government. They each work within their areas of jurisdiction. And so within the 6 months, the idea behind that, Derek, would be I would sit down to shape the agenda with the provinces. And then within the year, I would conclude an agreement, an Alberta Accord, that would be the lead province for all of Western Canada. It's not just about Alberta. It's also, as you mentioned, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and British Columbia, who may not see itself as part of Western Canada. And the idea here is to conclude an agreement on a few subjects. First, equalization. Making equalization fair for Alberta, which means that if you pay into equalization and when things are not as well, then you're not penalized for it. And that equalization has to be understood throughout the country as being an extraordinary contribution by those who have the good fortune of having an economy that's doing well, but other provinces have a responsibility also in regards to receiving equalization. The second issue would be, I would be inspired by the Fair Deal panel, is pensions. Quebec has a Quebec pension fund. They've done it since the 1960s. I think Alberta should have its share of the Canadian pension fund that goes to Albertans and do like Quebec has and run that own pension fund. By the way, I was in the House of Commons in the 1990s when the CPPIB was created. We had a debate at the time, very few people know this, about creating more than one fund instead of the mega CPPIB. Why? There were two reasons. One, to de-risk. If there were more than one fund, you wouldn't put all the eggs in the same basket. And two, to create more competition. Makes sense. Now, this is significant for Alberta because if Alberta is running its own pension fund, this is a very powerful economic tool for Alberta, one you do not have now. You have the Alberta Investment Board, but this would be a very powerful tool. So the third, I know I'm taking a lot of time, but the third one's immigration. Quebec has a specific deal on immigration. Alberta should have the same deal. If it's good for Quebec, it should be good for Alberta. And what would this allow you to do that you're not able to do now? Choose the immigrants that you want to bring in according to your priorities in the labor market, for example. The other area is a police force. If you wish and that have an Alberta provincial police, that's fine. That's your decision. And as the federal prime minister who are responsible for the RCMP, I would facilitate that. And the fifth area would be trade, non-trade. So that would be the beginning of the Alberta Accord, a fresh start for Canada in regards to how we deal with Alberta and we deal with all of the country.
So anyone who watches The Pipeline will know I get very impressed with my ability to segue, and I'm equally impressed with myself right now. Alberta's going through a not-so-quiet revolution right now. In the 1960s and early 70s, Quebec started to assert itself as, Quebec Nation, or what have you, and to take back control. See this great segue? We had the Firewall Letter of 2001 signed by Stephen Harper and other largely academics and some other people in the business community in Calgary. We had the Fair Deal panel in 2020. And I think, so the direction continues to get more aggressive in terms of what a lot of, at least a large segment of Alberta is demanding. And Saskatchewan is, I think, coming along on some of these things. One of the major candidates for the leadership of the United Conservative Party of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has proposed something she calls the Alberta Sovereignty Act. I'm not sure how much you know about it, but this would more or less be an act that allows the legislature to declare certain federal legislation will just not be enforced in Alberta. It'll be on the books, but just will not be enforced. Other provinces have experimented with things like this in the past, just not quite so brashly enshrined it in legislation, but there were things like that with drug policy in British Columbia over time, and Quebec has done it to one degree or another. If the Alberta Sovereignty Act passes and you were elected Prime Minister, how would you react to it?
Well, and what you're describing in your introduction, by the way, is, you know, a move towards more autonomy of the provinces. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, folks. I mean, again, Canada is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. The only other country that is more decentralized than Canada, and I hope there's no one from Belgium here, is Belgium, and no one understands how Belgium operates. And their best period is when they had no government for a year and a half. But Canada, and also one of the features of Canadian federalism, contrary to other federations, is that the provinces are responsible for natural resources. That's an exception more than a rule. And so there's nothing wrong, Derek, with provinces assuming more autonomy. And the idea is that the federal government's job is to coordinate this to make it work. The federal government will continue to have very real powers. One of them is called the federal spending power, which is extremely important and gives them the ability to do a whole number of things. But we are stronger when provinces are strong.
Okay, so I know you've spoken a lot about autonomy and provinces taking control over their areas in provincial jurisdiction, but I mean to press on this, this specifically, the idea of not enforcing certain federal legislation on the provincial level.
Well, it depends. Let's try to give it an example. Let's take the environment, for example. You know, we could very well coordinate environmental processes so that whatever the provincial environmental process is, it is value for what the federal environment process is. You understand what? And I've seen that done before. You say, instead of doing 2 environmental processes, we're going to do 1. Or there will be the provincial environmental process that the federal government recognizes as being the equivalent of what the federal government would do. That is the kind of intelligent thing you do in a federation that works. I understand, by the way, very well what Danielle Smith is saying in regards to how we operate our federation. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm running, by the way, and why I think I would be, for this job, the right person, is that I actually think it'd be a breath of fresh air in Ottawa to have someone as Prime Minister who's been the Premier of a province and who actually understands how the country operates. And what I'm going to say may surprise a lot of people. I've been on both sides. But you know what? There's a lot of people in Ottawa who don't know how this country operates. They don't have a clue. And it's a bubble. And it is a bubble. I've experienced it. And I remember being Premier and saying to my colleagues, I only wish the feds would be as federalist as I was federalist. And let's say, I'll give you an example. Mr. Trudeau comes out of the campaign. He delivers a budget, does a deal with Mr. Singh. They're back on spending when actually we should be reining in spending. And then with Mr. Singh, he makes a deal where he says this. He says, we're going to try to do an agreement on pharmacare and dental care. Ladies and gentlemen, that is provincial jurisdiction, A. B, can I tell you something? When they come to the table, Derek, and say to the provinces, we want to do a deal on pharmacare and we'll co-fund it, I guarantee you the answer will be, we have seen this movie before. And as soon as there's a downturn in the economy, you guys are going to walk away from funding and we'll be left holding the program. It's not going to happen. And what does that say about that government? They don't get it. They don't understand how it works. Well, I think it'd be good to have a Prime Minister who does and who's been there.
Okay. Well, thank you.
By the way, I've never thought in my lifetime I'd have Jay Hill and his wife Leah applaud me so much. I may run you as a candidate in my campaign.
My reporters have just taken notes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Don't record
that. Since 2020, the federal government, the provinces have engaged in, we're switching gears a bit here. the federal government, the provinces have engaged in a very large suite of restrictions involving COVID. Lockdowns, mandatory masking, mandatory vaccines. This, in many respects, has created a breach. This has been particularly difficult for conservative leaders to handle, I think, as the libertarian portion, for lack of a better term, within the Conservative coalition, I think has become probably a larger segment than it has been maybe in the past. And it's created a breach with those kinds of voters. It has arguably taken down the last Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole. It, I think, very arguably took down the Premier of Alberta. We're having two leadership races here. You've been critical of Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Baber's support of the Freedom Convoy. And I know that you've said you want to get rid of the remaining federal mandates. I think absolutely everybody does. But I want to know if you believe that at least the federal mandates, and I know the provincial ones are a whole other kettle of fish here, but the federal mandates, do you believe that they were ever justified at any point in the last 2.5 years?
You mentioned Roman, and I want to say something about Roman. And I didn't know him very well before this leadership race, but I know enough about Roman to say this. Roman stood on a question of principle and sacrificed a lot to stand on those principles. And I want to recognize that, because that is something that doesn't happen very often and is admirable and says something about character. And he wasn't the last one to arrive at this, by the way. He didn't follow the parade. He was ahead of it, and he paid a price for that. Now, on this issue, which is always a very difficult issue, I think the federal government, I can't follow what their positions are now. I think as we all started on this COVID episode, no one had a playbook on how you do it. And I think we all cut slack for everyone, including whether it's Kenny, Ford, whether it's Legault in Quebec, or everyone. We're trying to figure out what is this and how do we deal with it and how do we protect people. One thing stands out in my experience and the Canadian experience relative to the rest of the world. It's our inability to treat people in hospitals, what we call our capacity. And that's what the main difference was between Canada and the United States. We did not have the hospital capacity to actually treat people. And that's something that speaks to a very urgent problem in the country. Our healthcare system was broken before COVID, and it's been made worse. I would, as a prime minister, do something that some people think is attacking a sacred cow, especially federal liberals. I would table a new Canada Health Act. I would allow the provinces to innovate. I'd untie their hands and allow them to bring in private sector care and remaining with a single payer so that we have a healthcare system to deliver services. And why? So that we not have lockdowns. So that we have a healthcare system that has the ability to absorb people who are sick, whether it's COVID or anything else. Now, right now, the confusion is, and the federal government, we have to admit, is broken right now. Can't deliver passports. Airports are a mess. The immigration department has a huge backlog. Michelle and I, my wife is with me. We traveled over here. She's on me every day. Put the mask on. Take the mask off at the airport. We walk through the desk. No mask. We go for security, have a mask. Take off security, take the mask off. Put it back on. Get on the plane, put on the mask. I mean, and that's all federal. I mean, it's total confusion. It doesn't make sense. In the meantime, everywhere else here in Alberta and in Quebec and everywhere else, you don't wear a mask. I get it. I mean, the federal government, I don't know what game they're playing with this, but it doesn't make sense. And on this issue, now we're going to go through different waves. I think we're not going to go back into lockdowns, but please, let's have the courage and wherewithal to fix our healthcare system so that we don't have to contemplate the worst of solutions to deal with an epidemic.
So I appreciate your answer around healthcare reform. That would obviously be a monumental change.
Yes.
And ICU capacity was one of the big distinguishing factors. I don't want to get my numbers wrong, but little Montana, with about a quarter of our population just south of us, had the same ICU capacity as Alberta.
Exactly.
And that should say something. And that obviously means we have a greater stress on our system than the Americans had, and that would contribute to things like lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. But I have to press. So within the lockdowns were pretty much provincial, but vaccine mandates were federal and provincial. When they brought in vaccine mandates, I suppose September last year, I'm sure it had nothing to do with election timing, but
not much, no.
Do you believe it had, Do you believe that there was ever any justification for federal vaccine mandates for, say, federal workers or travel?
There was a lot of reasons to encourage people to get vaccinated. I got vaccinated, by the way. 3 times I got vaccinated. And I got COVID, by the way. It didn't stop me from getting COVID. But let me share an experience that gives you my perspective on it. In the province of Quebec, Legault gets this idea that everyone in the healthcare system has to be vaccinated. Everyone, no exceptions. And then they go out there and every week they pound it. We have until, I think it was the 15th of November. Not vaccinated, you're going to be fired. Well, guess what? They backed off because there were going to be 15,000 people in that system who were walking away from their jobs. And then they said, well, you know what? We can't afford to let them go. Now, truckers, who were the heroes of the COVID period and celebrated, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. I mean, they're the ones carrying goods, and all of a sudden we discovered how valuable those who in our economy were either on trucking or working in shops or other words were. And then he comes in with this rule. Well, I don't think it works. So looking into the future, Derek, I don't see how you can impose it on everyone, because it's just not going to work, and we're going to hamper our ability to deal. There's other ways of working around it and making sure that we do as much as we can so that people have the ability to choose to protect their health and protect those around them.
Okay. So I've got the 5-minute warning on our chat here. Okay. So what I'm going to try and be brief, and if you can too, I'm going to try and get 2 questions. We're going to This is the lightning round.
I heard your warning.
All right. This question is a little self-interested, maybe a lot. In addition to the CBC, the federal government now directly subsidizes virtually the entire media, all the legacy media, and even a lot of the independent media. This means that independents like the Western Standard and some of the other independents here today, we're subsidizing massive, even multinational corporations that are media corporations with our corporate income taxes. And even more concerning, it means that the federal government now is in essentially the media licensing business. We went through it for fun just to see what would happen, and it was positively Orwellian. We also got the Online News Act coming, which would force social media giants to give preferential ranking and feeds to government-approved media. If you're elected prime minister, where would you stand on the media bailouts and the Online News Act? Would those be pieces of legislation you'd be prepared to do away with?
And congratulations, you do not receive any federal government money.
No.
And your subscribers are the ones who support what you do.
And we're stuck with them, yeah.
Well, and they're stuck with you. And so it's a two-way street, Derek. And so that's what I believe in. And I, as a conservative and someone who believes in the freedom of the press, I find it very difficult to accept that the federal government is funding. And can you actually look at a society in which the federal government's funding the press and the press is independent? They can say they're independent as much as they can and keep a distance. I find it difficult to accept that. So I would not fund the press. I don't think that's acceptable. And I'm here, by the way, I'm here with Western Standard because I also believe in the independent press.
Well, thank you. In 2020, the federal Liberals used a cabinet, an order in council to ban about 1,500 different firearms that they claim were military or assault-style rifles. This include some anti-tank missiles that I didn't know weren't banned until now. I really wish I would have known. I got my hands on some Russian anti-aircraft missiles. You don't know what we get up to in Alberta. But many of these were just otherwise normal hunting and sport shooting rifles, but largely just that had an appearance that looks scary to the uninitiated. But you said several months ago you would not change any firearms legislation. Since then, but since your announcement, the Liberals have also said they're going to bring in a bill to ban the sale of handguns. Does this mean you would not reverse the ban on what the so-called military or assault style? If you could maybe clear that up. And tell us, where do you stand on the changes between the Liberals on the 1,500 guns and then the handgun changes they say they're going to make? You're Prime Minister. What are you going to do on those two fronts?
Well, let me touch the essential points. The issue on guns in Canada is illegal handguns in cities. That's the issue today in this country. We have a home in Montreal. There's not a day, literally not a day where there isn't a shooting in plain daylight. I mean, people are shocked by that. That's what the federal government needs to deal with and make sure that we stop the illegal commerce of these illegal handguns coming in. Number two, this OIC should be revised by experts who are independent from the government and and politics and really define what it is that they call an assault and weapons. And you know what? We're going to end up with a much smaller list than what we have in terms of the federal government's baiting.
So the anti-aircraft missiles stay banned.
We'll have to see. The experts will pronounce on that. Mm-hmm. By the way, just an anecdote of that. The 97 campaign, some of you may remember, Jean Charest made a statement. He was running for as Liberal Prime Minister that we had to stop children having nuclear weapons in the basements of their families' homes. I mean, it was, and then the third thing I would add about all of this is something for conservatives. Every time we get an election campaign, the Liberals bait us on handguns every time. And you know what? Every time we take the bait. I'm going to run as a leader of a party and as in the next campaign on my agenda for the economy. And I'm very determined that there's one thing we're not going to do is run on the issues that the Liberals are going to throw at us. And we're going to stop. It's gotten to the point where I'm convinced now that conservatives are the most generous political party in the world. They go into election campaigns, they actually give it away to the Liberals. The Liberals don't win campaigns, we lose them, and we give it to them. But can we agree on one thing, on the whole issue? They will trot it out again. I guarantee you this will be an issue. They will want to make this an issue because that is exactly the way that they operate in a campaign. So all of us agree on what the main problem is in terms of guns. Please, let's focus on the things that we believe in as opposed to responding to our adversaries' taunts. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.